How are you? Given the state of the
I love the shirt. Lee, wherever you want to sit.
Can I move it further away? Since don't move the church, I'm moving further away.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Oh, with there's also handouts up there as well that has the PowerPoint on it. It's all announced all that good stuff. Do you want?
timing.
How are you? Good.
Now, I can't, that's what I'm trying to. Because it's a PDF, I don't know that it'll.
Well, that's okay. That's a smart screen, huh?
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, you can cast it and all kinds of stuff, but it's just.
When did they get this?
That'll work.
Sufficient?
Yeah, because then I can just scroll it up, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
You're okay with
I've done
that?
that before, but
There is a way to do other things, like a PowerPoint and use all these things. We just have not gotten our training on it yet.
that's quite all right.
Okay.
Never done it this way, but this has worked perfect.
Okay,
Yeah.
and it does have whiteboard capability. Not really sure how to walk you through that yet either. I think you can click that and then use that. I'm not positive
At this
yet.
point, I don't want to touch anything except for.
Do you want your agenda pulled up too, or no?
No, I
Okay.
think that's fine. Thank
Well,
you.
then I'll get you on camera and then you.
Okay.
Wait, camera set up.
We'll see.
And I remembered I had and then I see.
If you have not signed in, keep in mind there's a sign-in sheet right over here.
How are you?
Lee, how are you?
Fantastic. You go then.
Hey, Lee.
How are you, sir? You doing okay? Good to see you. Doing better. Yeah. Yes, we're excited news for you too. Yeah, we're gonna
Wow, that is good.
I know.
That is good.
I just go move.
Yep, they know it's you.
You know, somebody else started doing cow and they
That
invited me
is
to a meeting about
good.
cow and I was like, what's that? And then they're like, City of Wilmington? And I
Oh,
was
I
like,
love it.
I'll go there. I should be.
Yeah. So you have to be the AV expert too.
Little hats, not a woman of many hats, but, you know, little hats, they don't fit all the way, but I'm around.
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, no, somebody. It's a cool resource, so we're just still learning how to do it. It has a lot more capabilities. It's still too smart. Smarter than I like these things. Something like that.
Develop and sustain a systematic response that ensures homelessness is prevented whenever possible as a first priority, or if it can't be prevented, it's rare and brief, right? And that's a basic concept that's actually pretty nationally recognized now by the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness to communities around the country have embodied the same basic goal, that we're going to prevent homelessness wherever possible, or if it does occur, it's going to be rare and brief. You know, so people aren't cycling in and out, and that they're homeless is for the shortest period possible. because it's harmful. It's fundamentally harmful to adults and children alike. 35% of the households are renters. That's not unusual proportion. That's about 5,800 households in Clinton County are renters. 11%, and this isn't just renters, but 11% of all households in Clinton County, so 1 out of 10 households in Clinton County pays more than half of their income for housing costs. That's it. That's exceptionally high. The national standard is 30% in terms of what's considered affordable. If you're paying more than 30% of your income for rent, utilities, you're considered to not be in affordable housing. You're considered to kind of be inherently at risk because one event, one job loss, one medical emergency can like throw you out, can just throw you behind, and then you're not paying rent next month, or the utilities getting shut off, or whatnot. So 1 out of 10 households is not just paying 30%, they're paying more than half of their income for housing, and that's getting worse, not better. In Clinton County, the fair market rent, which is sort of the federal term for what an average rent is for a one-bedroom apartment, is $610. That's going up, that's not going down. And same thing for a two-bedroom apartment, going up at $742 a month. The rent affordable at minimum wage, if you were just a minimum wage worker working 40 hours a week, you would need to pay no more than $458 for rent to be affordable, right? So that's a great divide and gap there. The full-time hourly wage, using kind of these metrics to afford a one-bedroom apartment, is close to $12 an hour. If I was working full-time and I need a one-bedroom apartment, I better have, a $12 an hour paying job if I want to be in, relatively affordable housing, right? For a two-bedroom, that's closer to $14 an hour. By the way, I've got some references here. This is from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Their Out of Reach report, and then there's another website that uses American Community Survey data. It's called the County Health Rankings and Roadmaps website that looks at severe housing cost burden. So if you want to look at this data yourself, you can certainly open up those links. Some of the things I saw when I looked at, what do we have in terms of capacity to respond to people facing housing loss in Clinton County, is that there are resources. It's not that there aren't, certainly Community Action has resources, Job and Family Services has the Prevention Retention Contingency Program, Clinton County Shelter has a state-funded program that can do a little bit of prevention for people who are imminently at risk. That's what all these acronyms are, by the way. I'm not going to spell them out. And there's even the federal program called Supportive Services for Veteran Families program that serves veteran households who are at risk. And of course, there's housing subsidies, right, through the Housing Authority that can help, stabilize a household if they can get their hands on a subsidy. But those are still limited, and in some cases, they're not fully utilized. What we heard in some of our conversations was that, some folks don't know about the resources that are available, or they can't get there physically to go apply. And so we heard, that, for instance, PRNC, Prevention Retention Contingency, which is TANF funding for families who have an emergency need. There's very, very few families who use those dollars, and for different reasons, which we won't get into today. That's just to say that we've got resources, we can better use those resources, and we need more of them, right? Part of that is we need to better use them, we need to improve our coordination and information sharing. And there's some strategies that we can start to talk about to move us more in that direction. And then, as I mentioned, access issues. I'll tell you another quick story. I talked to another gal out at the campground who was also very distraught. Children's Services was also involved with her. I happened to knock on her door when Children's Services was expected, and she thought I was Children's Services. And she's like, oh, no, they're coming any minute, but I'll still talk to you. And this was a Friday, Michael and I were out there at the camp, and she said, I don't know what to do. my lot rent is due on Sunday or Monday, perhaps it was. It was $300. She didn't have $300, you know? And so here she was like, she didn't know what to do. She didn't know where to go. And she stuck out in the campground, right? On a Friday afternoon. So I got on that horn and called Denise and Darlene and got a hold of those guys and just let them know to get her connected up, right, to some assistance. But that's just to say that that's a good example of where sometimes we have a problem and we've got a solution and we've got to bring them together, right, and really focus on that more. So I'm going to shift now to temporary housing. I'm just going to kind of keep moving through. If you have any questions or thoughts, don't hesitate to interject. So when we think about temporary housing, the simplest way to think about it is it's time limited. It's not forever housing. It's not quote unquote permanent housing. It's really meant to be a temporary solution while somebody figures out a longer term housing solution. The two types of temporary housing I looked at are emergency shelter, of course, and what's just called transitional housing, which is usually time limited, you know, housing with service supports. There are 4 kind of programs I looked at, including the Clinton County Homeless Shelter, Hope House, the Sugar Tree Shelter, and Doan Street, which is operated by Talbert House. I want to say, did I get that right? Talbert House operates Doan Street. And Doan Street is a 6-bed, 6-unit transitional residence for men and women who are being referred through the Mental Health Recovery Board and their partners. But it's also primarily serving people who otherwise would be on the street and who need a temporary place to live. So I grouped it here. I included it, right? Even though we might not think about that as sort of a homeless asset, I guess, for one way to think about it. But I think it's an important thing to include in the mix because it basically serves that purpose. And then there are probably, but this is where I think more investigation is needed, I'm sure there are church groups and other nonprofits that are periodically putting people up in hotels with a voucher on a temporary basis. I'm sure Children's Services might do this periodically for families. It would be good of us to try to document, inventory that, at least to know who's doing that, if not the volume of that, because that becomes another resource, you know, something else that we can say is part of our inventory. But when we just look at these 4 programs, together we've got 70 beds in Clinton County for people who have nowhere else to stay, right, except for the street. That's actually really good. All things considered, that's really good and more than most counties of your size. And I'll say by way of example, I mentioned I'm working with Medina County. They have a population of maybe 180,000. They don't even have a shelter. You know, they've got a small faith-based, you know, kind of church basement, you know, kind of set up interfaith group that provides shelter. So you guys are ahead of the curve in that, and I want to really give you guys credit for, especially Denise and her crew, who way back in the late 80s figured out emergency shelter is a good thing to have, even in Clinton County. It was much needed. So thank you guys for leading the way on that. But, you know, others have come along. Lee and his team, you know, and the forerunners there at Sugar Tree figured out that there was more needed than that, stepped up, created some shelter space for single men who maybe had more difficulty in their lives. That's a really critical resource. Hope House is available. Hope House is run all by volunteers, so they're, you know, not always available, but they certainly provide an important resource for single women, sometimes single women who might have a baby with them, but primarily single women. And then, of course, Doan Street, as I mentioned. But that's your inventory, if you will. That's really impressive, I would say, all in all. Some of the things I looked at, though, in terms of what's the demand or need for shelter. So if we look at, okay, we've got 70 beds. Is 70 beds enough, right? And so this took a bit of sort of some extrapolation and sort of, you know, analysis that I had to, you know, kind of work on, sort of various assumptions behind here. I'll talk about some of those assumptions in terms of what's the annual demand. But I started to look at annual demand by first and foremost looking at how many people are unsheltered in Clinton County. And for those of you who don't know, Darlene and Denise and Amber and the team at the shelter every year do a point in time count, and many of you probably help with that, participate in that. That point in time count is a one night, snapshot of who's homeless on that night, including who's in shelter and who's unsheltered. And just last September, you guys did probably the most comprehensive point in time count you've ever done, particularly in terms of looking at people who are unsheltered. And I just want to again give you guys props for doing an amazing job getting out to the camps, getting out on the trails, getting to everywhere you could to try to find people who are unsheltered and document them. And that effort led to, I would argue, a much more realistic picture of unsheltered homelessness in Clinton County than you all have ever had before. And what you found, I'm just restating what you guys, many of you already know, what you guys found was you identified 103 individuals just in that one night in September who were unsheltered, or again, living in a place not fit for habitation, like a trailer with a tarp on top, right? 103 people. I did some calculations, this is just my math, I did some estimates here. I estimate that's about 65 households. If you consider some of those are families, some of those are single adults. I think there were 21 families, if I recall, thereabout. I might be getting my numbers mixed up. But 103 individuals were who were counted, and I estimate that's about 65 households. 49 of those were in Wilmington proper, right? They were found on the streets of Wilmington or under the bridges of Wilmington, right? Or in the woods around Wilmington. 45 were found out in those campgrounds, right? People living in really decrepit conditions. We also found 8 people out in Blanchester and 1 person out in Sabina. So it's not just Wilmington problem, it's not just a campground problem, it's a Clinton County problem. And you probably didn't find a lot of folks who didn't want to be found. So let's just say that too. This is probably an undercount, which is, troubling. I did some, extrapolation, because we don't have an annual way, we don't count people every day who are unsheltered. There's no accurate, enumeration of people who are unsheltered over an annual period. But in order for us to build a comprehensive response, we need to know how many people we have to serve every year, not just on a given night. And that's a really important kind of parameter. So you'll see all my analysis is based on calculating up or imputing to an annual count. So we can figure out on an annual basis how much of shelter, rehousing, and so forth do we need. So I annualize this number by simply doubling it. The assumption being that people who are unsheltered aren't just unsheltered for a night, they're unsheltered for a while. And you have some people who resolve, who leave, who are no longer unsheltered, and you have new people who become unsheltered. And so I used the state assumption, what's called the balance of state that oversees the 80 rural communities or counties in Ohio, including Clinton County, uses a factor of 3 when they extrapolate point time count numbers. I thought that was a little high. My wife actually runs the balance of state, just full transparency, so I talked to her about this too. And we agreed maybe, multiplying that by 3 was a little high, maybe a little overstated. So I was a little more conservative here, and I just multiplied it by 2, right? So the assumption being that over a year's time, maybe twice as many people you might find on a given night experience unsheltered homelessness. Maybe that's a little conservative, but let's just start with that, because that's still a pretty mind-blowing number if you ask me. So let's just say on an annual basis, there's 206 people, 130 households, who are unsheltered for one night or more. Some of those do go into shelter. Some of those experience both unsheltered homelessness, and then they go into shelter, or they're in shelter and they leave for whatever reason, and then they're unsheltered. So there's duplication, right? It's really important as we're sort of building up how many people need shelter every year that we come up with an unduplicated count. So I also applied an unduplication kind of factor here, and I forget my percentage, but it's roughly around 80%. Don't quote me on that. I don't have the math in front of me. But I made an assumption here that some percent of people who are unsheltered, right, also go into shelter. So about 50 of those who are unsheltered roughly annually also find their way into shelter. So an unduplicated, if you will, unsheltered count, this only matters for when we get to our total, I estimate to be about 155 individuals and 98 households who are unsheltered for one night or more and don't touch a shelter. They never enter shelter, right? So this becomes our unsheltered group. Like they don't even find their way into shelter, or they can't get into shelter, right? That's an important number we're going to come back to. When we look at shelter utilization or shelter demand, again, the point in time count in January showed that there were 22 people in shelter. That was 13 people at the Clinton County shelter, 8 people at Sugar Tree, and 1 person at Hope House. Now I want to be, again, really clear here. That was in September of last year. It's everywhere around the country, including Columbus and here and New York City, during the pandemic has experienced much lower number of people in shelter. So I actually don't think these are good numbers that represent an average day census. It was in the middle of some of the height of the pandemic. So I wanted to share this with you, but I actually didn't use these numbers to come up with an annual shelter count. Instead, I started with numbers that we had. So Denise and her crew really do a great job of tracking people who come into shelter, which of course, Clinton County Shelter is the largest shelter we've got, right? And so, but they've got really good data. And I looked at 2019, right, pre-pandemic, to try to get a baseline. 2020 is kind of a write-off. In other words, let's not look at 2020. It doesn't represent our normal kind of experience. So I look at 2019, assuming we're kind of move back to normal sometime, hopefully soon. In 2019, the Clinton County Shelter served 253 individuals who were in 204 households, right? So there were some families in the mix, right? So 253 adults and children who were part of 204 households. Most people served by the Clinton County Shelter are single men and women, but there are a decent number of families with children who go there too. Sugar Tree, and this is my estimate, Lee, based on the numbers you shared with me, and I made some assumptions based on what Denise shared with me about, well, we do see some guys from Sugar Tree come in there, so I deduplicated that. Again, I'm not going to get it. I'm happy to show all my math. I've got it all laid out in a spreadsheet, but I didn't want to get into those weeds today. But I came up with an unduplicated number, right? Sugar Tree serves more than this annually, but the unduplicated people who don't also hit Denise's shelter, I estimated to be about 25 individuals annually who aren't seen anywhere else, right? And those are also household, because you just serve single men. For Hope House, I did a similar approach, just estimating based on the number of folks that were shared with me that were served at Hope House in, I think it was for a 9-month period, and I extrapolated based on that, did some deduplication based on what Denise shared. Yeah, we do see some of the gals at Hope House too, some percent of them, so I extracted those. Came up with about 27 women, individuals, are served at Hope House. And then for Doane Street, based on what Colleen at the Mental Health Board shared with me, their numbers estimated about 14 individuals are served in those 6 transitional units a year. So this becomes our basis for understanding how many people annually are in shelter. It racks up to 320 individuals and 270 households. Again, the asterisk here is that these are estimates. It's based on a set of assumptions, but sometimes we just have to go with good enough numbers to get a gauge of how much capacity do we need. This is something we want to continue to monitor and adjust and track, and make sure we adjust our assumptions, or once we get, better data, if we're starting to track data across all these programs, we'll get to actual numbers eventually. But I would argue these are best estimates in terms of the information we have today. So let's run with this, right? Annually in Clinton County, I'll say it again, I estimate that 300 individuals, 270 households are served in shelter or transitional housing. Now, when you think about that plus that, remember that deduplicated unsheltered count. So we can rack it up and get to a total annual number of people who are sheltered or unsheltered, or I'll flip that and just say who need shelter, whether they're sheltered or unsheltered, right? Because I would argue anybody who's unsheltered implicitly needs shelter, even if they're not seeking it, even if they don't qualify for it, even if they're living in a trailer with a tarp on top of it, they need something better than where they're at, right?
Tom,
Yeah.
are these all Clinton Countyans, or do you have any transient people in that county?
It's interesting, I think that's often a question that comes up is, how many of these people are people who kind of grew up here, and most of the interviews we conducted, the people we spoke with were born and bred here, or they've been here a while. And I think, Denise, you can probably speak best to your data. I think only a small fraction of folks come from out of county. Is that right? Small fraction. So, and that's if we were to say like maybe 15%, if I could throw out a number of people who are homeless during a year, might have most recently lived out of county, like even if it was upwards to 20%, that is pretty consistent with most other communities. That's not an unusual. In other words, you're not a magnet for anybody. No one's moving to Clinton County to find their way into shelter, right? It just rarely happens, and that's not the nature of the problem. You know what I mean? So, but it's a great question. So, but if we just consider that people who are here are our neighbors, regardless of where they stayed last night or last week, period. I mean, let's just start with that. Then we end up with this count. Again, this is an unduplicated estimate of people who need temporary housing based on our best available data. I'm estimating to be 475 individuals or 372 households on an annual basis, right? That's, again, the unsheltered count that's unduplicated and the shelter unduplicated count based on current data. Now, here's the good news, is that based on the bed capacity you have, I don't think you need more beds. I actually don't think you need more shelter. Your shelter utilization that I estimate, some of this is based off the Clinton County shelter, some of this is based on what I heard from, Lee, what I heard from Hope House, is that, maybe on any given night only half the beds are full. Now, sometimes all the beds are full, right? Sometimes, less than those are full. The point being is that, and again, this is 49% is an estimate, so don't put too much weight on that. But I think the point is that you're rarely in a position where there's no bed tonight for somebody who needs shelter, whether they're seeking it or not. And so I'm not recommending that you go out and build new shelter capacity. That's not actually the need. What I see the need being, and by the way, this is like, I should have pointed out, the estimated additional individuals that could be served with the unused bed capacity is 281 individuals, right? If you were to fill every bed every night, that's sort of the presumption, every bed every night, you can serve 281 more people. You've only got 155 people, I'm estimating, who never make their way into shelter. So I don't think you've got a gap in shelter capacity. I think you've got a gap in shelter availability. And this is principally because all your shelter and temporary housing is here in Wilmington proper. And yet you found 8 people out in Blanchard who were unsheltered. You've got 45 people living out in places they shouldn't be living, or they deserve better. But they can't either get into Wilmington, or it's not convenient for them, or it's just not where they've grown up. Like, I'm sure some of those 8 people you found in Blanchard, were born and bred in Blanchard, right? And they're not necessarily inclined to come to Wilmington. or to go out of county. The point being is that what I did see is a need for some more flexible, non-facility-based options for people who are not able or have other barriers to making their way to a shelter bed in Wilmington proper. That could be more flexible hotel vouchers. That could be some other, creative sort of temporary solutions that are accessible periodically in Blanchard or Sabina or other areas of the county. There are ways, and we're not going to figure out those solutions today. That's what our ad hoc conversations we'll do next. We'll start to unpack that a little bit and figure out how can we make sure people aren't unsheltered or unsafely housed simply because they can't access a bed here in Wilmington, right? Which I think is really the fundamental need. So I wanted to share too, just by way of background, some of the key characteristics of clients, and this is all based on the Clinton County homeless shelter data, which again is really good, and it's not representative of everybody, but it's just those who went to Clinton County shelter, so it doesn't necessarily represent, the men who go to Sugar Tree, who never touched this shelter or Hope House, and so forth. But it's still, I think, it's good information, and it sheds a little bit more light on characteristics of people who experience homelessness. And there's some really important things here that I think we should focus in on. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, only 21 families were served at the Clinton County shelter in 2019, 183 single men and women though. So way more singles than families with children, which is great, right? Nothing's great, but it's better than having more children who are homeless, right? But really more importantly, I looked at the prior living situation data. This is every time, Darlene and staff, they're doing intake at the shelter, you guys are recording, where did that person stay the night before, right? And it's called prior living situation. And there's always a little bit of, play in these numbers because, sometimes it's late at night, sometimes people aren't really clear, they don't want to say or whatever, but it's good enough. And what we saw in that data was that almost half of the people entering Clinton County shelter were in a homeless situation the night before. Maybe they came from Sugar Tree, maybe they were out under the bridge somewhere or in a tent or in somewhere unsafe. Half of the people coming into the shelter were already homeless. That just tells me that we've got some work to do to getting to people before they're homeless, or we need to work on our coordination strategies a little bit more. But maybe the bigger thing that I took away from this data was that about a third of people coming into shelter, and this is also pretty consistent with national data, a third of people were staying with family or friends, and only 7% were coming from their own rental unit. So if your thinking is that, we gotta, homelessness prevention is helping people avoid and pay off a late notice on their rent, then your thinking is off. Because most people who experience literal homelessness aren't coming the night before from the place they just got evicted from and perhaps, were set out from. They're coming from a friend or relative's place because they already lost their housing or they never had it to begin with, right? And that's a really important thing because if we start to think about where do we target prevention, how do we get upstream so we can choke off, if you will, people who are coming into shelter. The first place we should be looking are to people who are doubled up. Yes, we care about people who are falling behind our roof. We don't want people, losing their housing and then going to have to stay with mom or going to have to stay with a relative or a friend. But if we have to prioritize our efforts, we should focus on people who are doubled up and doubled up only temporarily. Those are the folks we need to focus in on as a priority, not exclusively, but as a priority if we're going to start to choke off the number of people who experience the worst housing crisis, which is homelessness. So this is really a good, if we wanted to sort of put it in a forensics, kind of frame, if we're doing our investigation, this is a good clue here where we need to focus our efforts. Monthly income. About half of the adults coming into the shelter have no income at all, right? These are not folks coming in with, they're just looking to use the shelter to save some money. right? They don't have any money to save. 47% had zero income coming in of adults. But on top of that, 40% of adults who had income only had $1 to $1,000 in income, right? So think about that. $1,000 per month, go back to that what does it cost to rent housing? $1,000 per month isn't going to get you affordable housing. You're not going to rent anywhere where you're not at risk in Clinton County unless you're subsidized. 28% of adults were employed. 28%. So only 1 out of 3 adults were employed. But also, to me, that's an opportunity, right? 28% are employed. I bet a lot more want to be employed or could be employed with the right support, even if they're disabled. 28% were unemployed, or were employed, sorry. So, 2/3 were not employed. And then as far as exit destinations, and again, this is a clue. Where do people go when they leave the shelter? Well, good news is almost 70% exit to quote-unquote permanent housing, stable housing they can continue to stay in. But over half of those who go to permanent housing are going back to family and friends. So, yeah, it might feel stable for now, right? But it may not be a permanent, a longer-term viable placement. This just tells me that if almost 60% of people who are leaving to a stable housing situation are still with family or friends, those follow-along stabilization services and connections and maybe assistance to kind of move again to their own unit, for some households that might be the ultimate goal. There's still work to do there, right, for those households. And these are households who remain, in some sense, at risk of falling back to homelessness. They didn't move into their own housing with a lease that gives them 12 months, of a lease and they've got some landlord-tenant rights, and if they can't pay the rent, at least they can play it out through the court if they had to. These are households who are moving back with family or friends who they're one conflict away from being asked to leave. They're one conflict away, right? And that's most often what happens in those situations is people, they butt heads, get out. It's time to go. We heard that in our interviews, by the way. And I'll share a story in a minute about that. Some other key findings, just really quick. There's definitely every day there's coordination happening, as I heard just anecdotally, amongst the providers here in Clinton County. You guys are working every day to coordinate for clients. But there's more work to do there. There's definitely more work to do there. And part of that is called coordinated entry or coordinated access. And this is where we start to develop sort of a single or virtual, even a distributed, if you will, front door. So no matter where somebody presents, if they show up at Father's Kitchen or they call the shelter, they're screened and triaged in the same basic way, right? And first and foremost, they're diverted from shelter if they've got somewhere else safe to go. And I know that's usually what you guys are doing. You're trying to not just admit somebody because they're asking for shelter. You're trying to figure out, hey, what's going on, guy? Let's see if we can figure out some other solution. But how can we make that a more consistent approach and make it not something that's easy to find, right? So if I'm staying out in Blanchard in a tent and I'm like, to heck with this, I'm ready to go into shelter, or Darlene's come out and talk to me and I'm ready to come into shelter, is there a single way to get into shelter and maybe get triaged to the best available shelter bed that night, right? So maybe Darlene's talking to me, but I get triaged into Sugar Tree because that's really the best fit for me. So that's what I'm talking about. I mean to play out a solution that, ahead of our conversations, but that's how it could play out, right? As we start to talk about improving our coordination. There's other things too that I noted that are important to focus in on, including currently there's a limited ability to shelter people who have really active, perhaps severe substance use or behavioral issues. We heard stories about folks who had to leave because they were just so disruptive, it was just too much, right? But that doesn't mean the consequence has to be go stay on the street. There are other solutions. There are other ways we can safely house people, even if they're actively using. There are ways to do it, believe it or not. And we can start to explore those approaches. There's no magic wand here. It's a hard thing to develop, It might require more investment. It might require more specialized staff to be on site at some facilities to help people who are actively using. It might require good training in Narcan and having access to clean needles. I'm just being really blunt here. If our objective is not to have people die on the street and to at least get them under roof so that we can then help them move forward, as bad off as they may be, we have a better opportunity if they're under roof than if they're out in a tent or sleeping in their car in the woods. And then again, programs are exclusively in Wilmington, something that we should look at. Now I'm going to shift to rehousing. When I look at sort of rapid rehousing, which is a type of intervention that's time limited, typically involves help with finding a housing unit, so housing search assistance, helping get connected with the landlord, typically involves help with first month's rent, utilities, and maybe some ongoing rent assistance for a number of months, but it's limited. Only a short number of months, typically 3 to 6 months, sometimes up to 24 months. And then some stabilization services, so helping people understand the lease, helping people figure out how to, not piss off the neighbor, right? Figure out how to work through those issues that come up with the landlord. So we're rapidly rehousing and then providing some stabilization supports so they don't bounce back. That's what rapid rehousing does. In Clinton County, you've got capacity annually to serve about 67 households. That's a calculation that I made. It's based on the number of full-time equivalent positions you have, including Ginny at the Clinton County shelter, that SSVF program, that veteran program I mentioned, that also does rapid rehousing. And there's one other one. And there's a new program coming online that Alternatives to Violence is going to be operating for people fleeing domestic violence. It's going to be rapid rehousing as well. So if you rack all that up, again, I won't get into the math here, but you basically have about 1.5 full-time positions dedicated to providing rapid rehousing. If you think about like how many can they serve on a given night, how long do those households stay on? Again, you do the math, and I've got that all laid out. You come up with about 67 households can be served with 1.5 FTEs a year, right? But if you look at demand, how many people who are in shelter or who are unsheltered need what I just described? Help finding a landlord, help paying to get into housing, maybe paying on a little bit of a glide path while they get some income going, right? So paying the rent for a short while, helping with those stabilization services to help people, become better tenants, if you will, and resolve problems. If you look at that, I estimated that about 80% of people who are unsheltered need that type of individualized support, right? About 4 out of 5, roughly, my ballpark estimate. We can adjust these if you want. Just my ballpark estimate based on my own experience, a good number of people who are unsheltered need that type of handhold. About half of those who are sheltered, so it's a little bit less severe for folks who are unsheltered, they tend to be just slightly better off sometimes, less severe issues, there's reasons people are unsheltered. About 50% of people who are sheltered, I estimate. So that amounts to 213 households annually of our total, remember that 400 and some, who I estimate, about half of them, a little bit less, would need rapid rehousing assistance. Well, that amounts to 4.4 FTEs. So my estimate is you need another 3 full-time positions to provide that specialized rapid rehousing service, which is really an intensive, you usually have a caseload of no more than 1 to 20, like 20 cases you're working with at a time, so it's manageable, and you can provide that individualized support and assistance. You probably need about 3 more full-time positions doing that work to really make sure you have full capacity in Clinton County. Again, that's my estimate. If you're to look at permanent supportive housing, which is another type of rehousing assistance, permanent supportive housing is ongoing subsidy with no time limit, so much like Section 8, but that comes with case management services and other supportive services ongoing without a time limit. So it's like rapid rehousing without a time limit, right? If you look at permanent supportive housing, your current capacity right now is you've got an opportunity, I characterize it as annual placements. right? Because it's not like there's 10 units of permanent supportive housing in Clinton County that are like, you know, that apartment over there. But rather, you've got a program. It's actually operated by the CAC out of Fayette County, the Community Action Council out of Fayette County. They have a permanent supportive housing program for people who are chronically homeless, and they can serve about 10 referrals a year from Clinton County. Now, here's the caveat, is that in order to access that program, to move into one of those units with the subsidy and services, you got to move to Fayette County, right? So I see that as sort of a very limited opportunity. And what you need is opportunities here in Clinton County where people want to live and not force people to uproot and move to Fayette County or somewhere else to access permanent supportive housing. But nonetheless, you've got this capacity. It's not something we want to write off. But then you've also got other supportive housing placement. Lee and I were just talking, if I may, Lee, just right before, about a cool opportunity Lee's looking at that might provide more, you know, transitional, but really non-time limited, ongoing, supportive, you know, kind of housing opportunities for some guys. So that's, but what we don't know yet is how many of those are sort of naturally available. So this might be additional needs assessment work is needed here to understand how many times do people move into, I know that's not available yet, Lee, but just as an example, how many times do people move into other, you know, kind of ongoing supportive environments, maybe into just subsidized housing with ongoing mental health case management and other supports, which kind of basically works like permanent supportive housing. That was a number I couldn't get my hands on. Really, it might require a little bit more investigation. But if we look at demand, and again, this is an estimate, you've got about 33 chronically homeless individuals today, right? Based on the point in time count, based on some other data, and based on, you know, some estimates that I applied. 33 people who are severely persistently disabled who have been homeless for more than a year, right? That's one number. The other number is I estimate that, and Denise, this is kind of based on what you share with me, there's a good number of people who come through the Clinton County shelter who are severely and persistently disabled, right? And I estimated that based on what Denise, you shared with me, virtually all of them need ongoing subsidy and services. So I bucketed them here too. So that's about 135 individuals if I were to, you know, kind of extrapolate across all the programs. So in other words, you've got a gap. And it's a gap that we can't fully determine yet. And I say that because I don't believe the homeless system, like we need, there's dedicated funding through federal sources and state sources specifically to build or to pay for vouchers for homeless housing, permanent supportive housing for people who are homeless. But those resources are really limited. There's more opportunity to basically create supportive housing like permanent supportive housing like opportunities if we start to pair up housing choice vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, or other subsidized housing with services together that then basically operate like permanent supportive housing. So I don't know what that gap is yet. I think we've got some more work to do there. So I just flagged it as TBD, right? We've got some more understanding to figure out how many other placement opportunities are needed. Do we need to talk with Colleen, folks at the Mental Health Board, and other partners, Talbot and so forth, about, you know, how to start to create these opportunities? So some of the key findings there are, again, you've got some limited but underutilized rapid rehousing capacity and housing subsidies. We know housing costs are rising significantly, and what I like to say is that people are increasingly screened out and priced out of housing because landlords, it's a landlord's market, and landlords can screen out if you've got an eviction, if you've got any kind of criminal record, if you've got any kind of blemish on your credit, you know, you're more likely increasingly to be screened out. And as I said earlier, you're also increasingly priced out. So these are working against our efforts to rehouse people, and it suggests, and to me, it just sort of bolsters the need for more of these supportive opportunities. And then lastly, in service and resource supports, again, just some additional kind of perspective on characteristics of clients who we've got good data on who come into the shelter. Just again, to give us some clues here, there were 21 unaccompanied youth who were 18 to 24 who came into the homeless. These are individuals who, by definition, are still developing human beings. Their brains aren't fully developed until they're 26, right? They need specialized intervention that are attenuated to youth, and there's strategies like positive youth development and other ways of engaging youth that we should start to talk about that are more focused and unique to meeting the needs of young people who are both homeless and still matriculating into adulthood. There were 7 veterans, which is great news. It was a very low number. That's pretty consistent with national data. There's been a rapid reduction in veteran homelessness nationally because the VA is serious about ending veteran homelessness. And that SSVF program I mentioned is a big part of that. And there's other resources like HUD-VASH vouchers and so forth that help with that. But nonetheless, there are still some veterans, and those veterans have resources they should be connected to. And I'm sure you guys do that, but there might be some more work to do that, right? The good news is you got the VA right next door to the shelter, which I thought was pretty cool. As I mentioned, 28% of adults are employed. 77% of adults coming to the shelter have health insurance. That's huge. That's huge because every one of those who have health insurance, mostly Medicaid, so they got a Medicaid managed care provider. 77% have a Medicaid managed care provider who probably would be interested in knowing that their member is literally homeless, and they might offer them more intensive care coordination and access to services, because guess what? That managed care organization has a bottom line, and they're looking to make a profit. And their profit is driven by their outcomes and how well they help people reduce utilization of costly healthcare services. And our healthcare friends know now that there are things called social determinants of health, including housing instability and food insecurity and so forth, that drive healthcare costs. And so there's a win-win opportunity here, and that's why I wanted to flag this, for us to start thinking about how do we get our managed care organizations, how do we start to create some protocol here. Anytime we see somebody walks through the door with a Molina, as their health insurance, or United, or Buckeye, or Paramount, or whatever, how do we make sure we're immediately picking up the phone and figure out who their care coordinator is and say, hey, we got your member here. You might want to know that. By the way, what can you do to help? And sometimes they can even offer financial assistance, believe it or not. So there's some things there to unpack. As I mentioned, 28%, 1 out of 3 adults roughly who come into the shelter have 1 or more severe and persistent disabling conditions. Those are conditions that impede their ability to secure and stabilize in housing. 28% of adults have a severe or persistent 1 or more disabling conditions as they report to the shelter. And most of them are already connected. Everyone we interviewed, almost to the person mentioned the case manager that they were working with, at Talbert or some other agency, right? So they're working with folks. So I see that as an opportunity too, to just kind of think about where and how can we collaborate more to kind of get this person housed as quickly as possible, right? And then stabilize and connected to those community supports. Some other things I noted too, just in the interviews, 10 out of 12 that we interviewed at Father's Kitchen, that Michael and his students interviewed, I should say, at Father's Kitchen, who were just coming in for a hot meal, indicated that they or someone in their household has a severe persistent disablement. Now, not all these were homeless, but surely every one of them was, many of them were homeless. Many of them were just living on a thread. Excuse me. And the majority that we interviewed, this isn't representative, it's just a convenient sample, if you will. But nonetheless, most who were interviewed said they had, or one of their household members had, a severe persistent disablement. The point being is that we're talking about people who walk in the door often with, a severe condition that oftentimes is driving their housing issues, right? And these conditions are most often treatable. So I wanted to flag that. And only 6 out of those 10, by the way, who have a severe persistent are getting any disability-related income. That to me is a flag. Well, if 10 of them say they have severe persistent, or their household member does, how come only 6 of them have income that supports them because they're disabled? We got 4 more people we got to get, or whatever proportion, right? Transportation, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know, was the most frequently cited barrier. This is very common in rural communities, especially even in urban communities. You know, it's that last mile phenomenon. You know, you got 3 kids dragging behind you. You got to get to that bus stop that's a mile away. Well, good luck. And then you got to change 3 times. Well, in Clinton County, you don't even have a bus stop to walk to. There's no bus stop outside of Green Meadows, I don't believe, right? And so, like, this is a problem. I don't have a magic solution. I think it's something we just have to look at. I know there's a transportation study and effort going on that we need to pair up with and get connected to more directly, so I just want to flag that. Child care options and costs were also commonly cited. One gentleman I spoke with at Clinton County Shelter got his daughter back and shared that, you know, he couldn't go to work because he didn't have child care during the day to go to work. And there's no child care at night. You know, good luck finding that. So he was stuck for a while. And that was a big part of why he was stuck. Many people, principally women, of course, report being involved in an abusive relationship now or recently. In fact, that was a very common theme in our interviews. You know, that story I told about Jane leaving abusive, that was not uncommon, right? So we have to consider that many of these folks are traumatized, and they're currently being traumatized, or they're still recovering, and they're in that cycle of abuse, and oftentimes find themselves back with those abusive partners, not because they want to be, but because, you know, things happen, right? I think I noted that there is some opportunity to improve coordination for people who are involved with multiple systems. You know, many of the families I spoke with were already involved with Children's Services. I know Children's Services, as was shared with me, you know, is moving towards more of a preventative model, right? And so I think there's opportunity there to kind of pair up those resources and start to think about how we serve those families better. And then finally, I noted that individualized service and resource navigation is oftentimes the most critical need. How can we, in other words, for everybody on any given day who's homeless or imminently at risk, make sure they've got a go-to person that can help them navigate housing assistance and services that are already available, but they don't know where to find or how to get to, right? So oftentimes that's the most, I heard this a lot at Sugar Tree, the guys I talked to at Sugar Tree. One guy said he walked down the street to get his, I want to say his license, I want to say it was, and you know, there was something he needed, he didn't have. He got confused, basically. He got confused in the process. He's like, all right, I guess I can't get my license. You know, well, you know, if he had somebody maybe more like walking with them, you know, had the time to walk with them and follow through and, you know, redirect him back, get that paperwork in order, get that license, you know, he might not be in the same spot today. That's, again, upfront investment that'll save us long term, and most importantly, save that person additional misery. I just want to kind of cap off this, and I'm going to pivot here. Some of the quotes that I thought, I'm just going to read this. These are all quotes. So one person said, last time I applied for disability, it just seemed like they didn't want me to because I didn't have much time to return the paperwork. And he gave up. I was evicted because I lost my driver's license. The guy I was talking about. I was evicted because I lost my driver's license and then I lost my job. I can't apply for a new job since I don't have an ID. I'm stuck. I couldn't leave my daughter. I'm sharing some of these same stories, obviously, they're top of mind. I couldn't leave my daughter alone in the hotel room or shelter while I worked. Applied for child care subsidy, but I had to show 30 days of pay stubs, which I didn't have. That's a solvable problem. Having a felony really kills your ability to rent an apartment. I don't have anywhere to go during the day. Everything is closed to us during the day. Don't put us outside. We're all people. by the way, this was a former Marine, a Vietnam veteran who's been homeless on the streets for 10 years in Clinton County. My rent is due in 3 days and I don't know where to get help. That's that gal I told you about. And lastly, sometimes shit happens and people end up in places they never thought they would. People just need a chance. So I wanted to leave you with those quotes because they moved me a lot. And then finally, I want to share with you this story about Pete. Pete's a young man. He'd been staying with his dad, but got kicked out when he turned 18. He went to stay with his aunt for 6 to 7 months, but extremely poor, as he called it, nasty conditions, including cockroaches, etc., caused him a lot of distress, and he had a dispute that caused him to leave. Pete then spent the last 4 years staying on and off with his dad, who he didn't get along with, and his aunt, who he also had frequent disputes with, and various friends, all the while struggling with major depression and suicidal thoughts. This past spring, Pete went to a treatment facility for 4 days before he came to the shelter, as he had nowhere else to stay. Pete says he's got food stamps, and he tried to get SSI a few years ago, but was told he would have to wait 2 years. Don't know what that meant. He has a broken hand and a messed up shoulder. His case manager from Talbot House is helping him apply for housing, though he was told that it would be hard for him since he has no income. Pete is willing to work as he's able and said he just wants a stable place to live and have someone help him find a landlord and be a source of support. Again, Pete's about 24. He's still a developing human being, right? And so some of my takeaways about Pete is that, again, he's still maturing. What's happening to him today is going to affect him for the rest of his life. We are hardwiring problems for Pete right now if we don't help him get better help. Pete's receiving mental health case management and help from the shelter, and he likely qualifies for additional both rehab, workforce, healthcare, and Social Security income supports. And again, with the right coordinated housing and supports, he can achieve stable housing, obtain income, improve his well-being, and increase his independence. He is not a lost cause. So let me, I know we're running a little short on time. I'm going to push us forward. This, I want to share with you now just some proposed goals around each of those 4 areas and what we're going to do next in terms of moving to action. And I've started to frame out these proposed goals, statements. I shared them briefly with the steering committee. We're not going to dive into like the words on this screen today. We're going to dive into these in our ad hoc meetings, our follow-up meetings, where we'll massage these a little bit if we feel we need to. But these basically represent, for each of these areas, what are we aspiring to do? What is the aspirational state? And so like one example is, for prevention, people experiencing a housing crisis will have immediate, coordinated access to housing stabilization and homelessness prevention assistance. That's our goal. We may also, and I didn't go here yet because I want to do this in our ad hoc conversations, establish a measurable goal around how many people or what percent of people who access prevention assistance successfully resolve their crisis and don't become homeless. That'd be the next, sort of aspect of this goal statement we want to develop. But I didn't want to get ahead of our work together. I don't want to be, this isn't like Tom's thinking. I want this to be our thinking about what those goals should be. But I'm giving you a jumping off point that we'll bring into our ad hoc meetings. Some of the opportunities as well, again, these are just jumping off points. You can take them or leave them. But the things I saw in the prevention space that I think are like things we might want to talk about is improving access and utilization of our existing resources, developing these cross-sector collaborative strategies. So are we engaged with the hospital here? Do we have a good, discharge planning process for people exiting the county jail, so forth and so on? Do we have regular means for sharing information? to make sure everyone is aware of what's available in the ever-changing world of emergency assistance? Do we have regular educational opportunities that are around how to help people with housing needs? So for example, do the case management departments at Calvert or Brightview and so forth, do they have a housing component to their training, or can we work on developing that together and bring the expertise of, the team at the Clinton County Shelter and Jenny and so forth, into that team to share those learnings. I do feel we have some additional needs assessment that we have to look at, particularly, who's actually exiting, how many people exit the county jail to the street. I think it'd be an interesting thing to look at. Is there an opportunity there to stop that from happening, to kind of choke it off at that point of exit, if you will? Same thing with other treatment facilities, people exiting foster care, aging out of foster care. I think those are important things to look at. In temporary housing, again, just an example goal statement. We can come back to that, just that people have ready access to decent, safe temporary housing assistance when needed. But the opportunities are making sure we have improved access, starting to look at maybe a single, what's called a by name list, a real-time list of everybody who's homeless on any given day, to the extent we can have that awareness, so we don't lose anyone. So we always know, well, what's going on with John? Who's got John today? Is there a case manager assigned? Do we need to do a case conference to talk about John because he's stuck, right? If we can't see them, we can't help them. If we don't know them by name, we're probably not quite there yet. Let's look at maybe flexible hotel motel options, other types of options that will expand access to temporary housing and assistance in places like Blanchard. And let's look at making sure our current facilities, most especially Hope House and Sugar Tree, have the resources they need to do the job they're trying to do. And I heard from both that they could use more public-private resources to help do the job, maybe provide more services. Hope House can move from a voluntary staff to maybe some paid staff and so forth, be open all the time versus intermittently and so forth. And then again, some additional needs assessment around inventorying hotel motel assistance and maybe talking to some of those low-cost hotel operators, which I didn't have the opportunity to do, to hear from them. Who are they seeing? I think that's also a good place to look at people who are about at the end of their rope. If they're not a family or friends, they're probably staying at your cheapest motel in Clinton County. If they have the nickels to scrape together to do that before they go to the shelter, because no one really wants to go to shelter unless they really have to. So let's take a look at that. On rehousing, again, people have access to immediate coordinated rehousing assistance as a basic kind of goal statement. We can come up with a measurable target for that. Some of the opportunities is leveraging existing capacity, so we're not creating something we don't have to create. Maybe we're just better utilizing and targeting existing opportunities and resources across sectors. Let's look at whether there are opportunities, again, to improve rehousing assistance for people exiting treatment or the hospital or the jail, so they have immediate rehousing assistance. Let's look at coordination with other supported housing, senior, disabled, assisted living facilities to make sure, I know there's partnerships already, but we can surely continue to build those and enhance those partnerships. And we have some willing partners who are on the coalition. And I apologize, I don't know everybody by face, and it's the first time meeting, but you might be here in the room, who have offered, to do just that, to start to talk about, pairing up our low-income housing, our subsidized housing, providing some more preferences for people who are homeless. And then let's look at whether there are other opportunities, again, with residential programs to connect people to more directly. And then finally, with service and resource supports, again, you can tell there's a theme here in these statements about making sure, as an aspiration, people have access to immediate coordinated services and resources to support stabilization and other critical needs. Some of the opportunities there, again, you're going to sense a theme here. but creating cross-sector partnerships. And I want to pause on this one for a moment. I think this idea of, you know, some of you have heard this term case conferencing. It often happens with social service programs where you do case conferencing with those challenging cases. Maybe it's just happening with a supervisor in a weekly supervision. Maybe it's a team conversation around those challenging cases that you have casually or more formally. But there are ways to do case conferencing also at a provider level, so where, you know, people from different providers are on a regular basis coming together to talk about those cases we all know about. So let's talk about John. John's at Sugar Tree, but you know he's also getting rapid housing assistance from Ginny. You know, do we have a regular table to sit about to sit around to talk about those common clients? And then there's a macro level, right? So that's kind of the meso, if you will, going back to that micro, meso, macro. At the macro level, I think a real thing to start to consider is there a community table of key cross-sector partners, justice, child welfare, job and family services, homeless assistance, workforce, other key providers, and public system representatives who periodically, let's say once a month, convene to talk about those cases we all know about, who are hitting all of our systems, who we need to all be on the same page with. And one person maybe runs point, but we're all working as a team to support this person. And this isn't like a new idea necessarily, but to operationalize that idea, I think has been perhaps, elusive. My own experience is very hard to set those things up, but it can be done. And there's good examples. One I know about out of Lethbridge, Canada, where they do this exact thing. They have a way to kind of bring forward to that community table those complex, multi-system involved cases that, we have to have a deeper cross-sector conversation if we're going to help this person move forward. And so I want to kind of put a pin in that idea. We can come back to it. Looking at transportation, issues and barriers is key. And then I think increasing access to income, non-cash benefits, healthcare, childcare, and other supports is also important. And lastly, I think creating more engagement opportunities, drop-in locations, particularly for youth, and making sure that there are safe places for people to gain access to assistance that are low barrier, that don't require any conditions to walk through the door. And maybe sometimes somebody will say no for a long time, but eventually they'll say yes. And how do we create those spaces that where we're engaging people and always having that open door opportunity? And I think there's some things there to look at. So I know I'm talking fast and furious, trying to get through a lot here, just trying to lay it all out for you. I want to talk quickly about next steps. And so today, again, the idea was, in the next step, specifically around creating our strategic action plan. So just as we start to move forward, how do we create this strategic action plan? I think it does begin with establishing what our sub-goals are around each of those 4 areas. What are we trying to do on an aspirational level, and what are those measurable things we can be accountable to, that we can talk about? So we started to lay that out in some of those opportunities today. But what we're going to be doing next, as I mentioned earlier, is moving into time-limited ad hoc groups around each of those 4 areas. I'll be sending out an email next week to the entire coalition, inviting folks to sign up for one or more of those ad hoc groups. And I want to really emphasize that, this is your plan. This is your strategy. These will be your actions, not Tom's actions. I won't be here forever. I'm here to just help you get rolling on this. So we really need folks to kind of step up next week, to volunteer, to participate. And again, we'll try to be very mindful of the time that's needed for these ad hoc groups. The way I'm kind of envisioning it is that when I send out this invitation next week, I'll include, who wants to, tell me which of these 4 groups you'd like to participate in, and then we'll get time scheduled. I might go ahead and just identify a tentative date just to get it rolling later in August, early September. ideally, most people who raise their hand will be able to make those times instead of trying to coordinate, schedules amongst a lot of different people, just to get the ball rolling. We'll meet late August, early September. We might have 2 meetings, maybe 3, depending. We're going to kind of play that by ear. We'll at least have 1 meeting. And each of those groups, I will ask to review and revise the goal statements, to determine high-level measurable targets. Like, what are the measurable things we can track and be accountable towards, and those related indicators, and then to identify and work to collect any additional needs assessment information. We might want to do a little bit more work gathering information. And then finally, most importantly, those ad hoc groups will be asked to identify what are the 1, 2, or 3, maybe 4, but let's keep it reasonable, let's keep it focused. What are those specific actions we're going to take in the next year or 2, but heading into 2022, that we are going to work on together to move us towards our goal? And we want those to be very concrete. We want somebody to own those actions or to step up and agree to take responsibility for working with others on that action, to just shepherd it through. And those ad hoc groups will develop those proposed actions. And at our next membership meeting in October, we'll ask those ad hoc groups to report back what the proposed goal statement is, any measurable targets, any additional things they learned, and what the specific actions are they are recommending. I expect that this group will just sign off on those, but there might be some dialogue too that we'll want to have. Hopefully things aren't so bad and we can meet in person, but we're going to kind of play that by ear. And then we will have a strategic action plan that we are going to be executing against. And that's been our goal, is to get to action and to move forward with things that are most impactful or most relevant, that we all agree are also things we should be working on. Whew. Okay. My goal was to stop talking at 11:50, and I'm at 11:51. So I want to pause and just ask, in our last couple minutes, I went through a lot, what are you guys sitting with? Are there any questions you're sitting with? And is there any additional information you think right now you want me to start or continue to work on unpacking, just in preparation for the ad hoc groups, or that somebody else can start to work on? So I'm going to stop talking. Questions? Yeah.
It sounds like one of the key components to finding some success is developing wraparound services and bringing a lot of synergy. I think we have a lot of the tools in our community. It's just getting them to work better together. Is there a technology or a platform out there that you can use as an interagency mechanism? So if you get Jane or Pete, whoever coming into the system, to where everybody can see. I know there's probably a lot of rules for protection of their confidentiality. It seems like there'd be a need for that. Emails and back and forth doesn't seem like it's a real efficient.
It's there are things out there, and I want to be mindful of, like, cost and scale relative to the size of the community, I guess. But I'm going to say it's Wichita, Kansas. The police department of Wichita, Kansas created a very interesting, it's really considered a national model, and it's based on an electronic platform for information sharing between police department, behavioral health providers, and homelessness providers. And it does kind of exactly what you're describing. It gets on the radar with if an officer engages somebody, they enter them into the system, they can immediately see, oh, you've got a case manager at so-and-so agency. Let me get that case manager on the line here. That's just one example. That community in Canada I mentioned, Lethbridge, they've got something a little bit different called helpseeker.org. It's actually a software that you can buy off the shelf, and what they do is they come in, they inventory all your community resources, and they help communities create these kind of cross-sector, cross-partner. It's not just like
a 2-on-1 system, if you will, where you just catalog resources, but they also have this back-end piece where you can do this kind of case tracking and conferencing, which I think is really cool. Helpseeker.org. They're actually based out of Calgary. I know that the director of it happened to talk fast for one time. But there's other, like, I think lower tech, less complex, less costly solutions that I think are maybe more feasible in the near term, you know, which is, I mentioned that by name list. You know, there are ways, even without like SugarTree, for example, signing on to like a big data system and all the cost that goes with that. There's lower cost ways of simply creating like encryption protected Excel spreadsheets. I mean, just to be really basic about it, that somebody takes responsibility for, and every time you got a new admission, you just enter a name, and with consent, you know, you enter a name, you enter some basic information, and with that person's consent, it's accessible to a select number of providers, you know, who can see that and say, oh, I know John, that's my guy, or whatever. You know, I think there's ways, and I think in the ad hoc conversations I'd love to get into, but I think we hit it on the head. We've got all the resources, most of them. Sometimes it's just about figuring out better ways, more efficient ways to coordinate.
Fayette County utilizes something similar to what you're speaking to. And I know we have a meeting out there next Wednesday, so we can kind of pick their brain and learn a little bit more. But I know first they were utilizing kind of like a Excel spreadsheet, and then they actually went to a more formal platform. But they've also created like their own team resource guide that they can take out, and they give out to like the motels and hotels that have all of the resource providers that are kind of working in conjunction with one another. Along with applications, because a lot of, you know, our clients that are truly in need don't even have internet access. So there's applications, directions, how to complete the applications, all in a neat little resource pack.
Well, especially if you equip case managers with mobile tech, which isn't that costly anymore, right? And a Wi-Fi hotspot. You know, you can bring the service to the people. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Andy, because, you know, part of what I noted, especially talking, I'm sure Darlene, you know this really well, leading your team, but part of what I noted in the campground is like, we've got to figure out how to get to people, not how to figure out how to get people to us. And so part of that is we need to move those front doors to the campgrounds. And how do we do that? Like, I think there's a lot, you just hit on some examples of that. But I think anything you can learn from Fayette County, maybe the solution is in our backyard, just across the county line.
Yeah.
Right?
I have a question. What, and I know you don't have a certain, like the exact percentage or anything, but I have noticed, being in this field, even in other counties and everything, that there is a certain percentage of people that their homelessness is not their primary concern or their primary thing they need to deal with. It is almost a cause of something else. Like, I know there was one woman that I know, she is chronically, she goes, she stays at the shelter, she gets transitional housing, she gets a job, she starts, and then she's just not mentally capable of, I guess for lack of words, being an adult.
Yeah.
She can't budget, she can't keep a job and pay her bills. And so it's this circle, I know 4 or 5 times in the last, 3 or 4 years, it just goes round and round and round, and it seems like there would be a way for someone somehow to see that and say, okay, maybe she needs some training, she needs to be taught how to be an adult.
Yeah. I think that's the fundamental challenge, right? But I don't put the onus on that person as much as on us, right?
Right,
it's like, how do we come up with a different, like what? It's like the definition of insanity, right? Like if you always do what you always did and expect something different, I guess you're really kind of insane. But that's I think that's it. Like what do we have to do differently? And maybe she needs sort of a fail-safe housing where it doesn't really matter what she does. She doesn't lose her lease.
Right.
She doesn't lose her key. And somebody's going to be there to help her with those extra skills to help her be a better tenant.
Yeah, no, something like that.
Yeah.
Like I said, it just goes around and
Yeah.
around.
Yeah.
And from the outside, I see it.
Yeah.
Because
It's interesting. I'll just say that the evidence shows that really robust permanent supportive housing programs, particularly those that provide, it's called, you probably know, assertive community treatment, so an ACT model, which is that wraparound team. Like you get a team working with you. It's a case manager, it's a vocational specialist, it's a peer specialist, it's a nurse, it's a doc. and a psychiatrist, all on one team. Those types of programs for people that you just described work very well, particularly when you provide it unconditionally in a housing first, as it's called, model, where your engagement in services doesn't mean you, if you choose not to engage in services, you don't lose your housing, because there's clinical strategies like motivational interviewing and others that help people, you eventually do get to engagement. It just requires you to do, more and better, strategies of working with folks and encouraging them. There's lots of clinical technique there. But those types of programs have very high rates of success in terms of ongoing tenancy and, probably surprisingly, engagement in services. When you provide services unconditionally without requirement,